firstly, thanks everyone for having us here at UX New Zealand. We're really honoured to be here today. And today we wanted to talk to you about dark patterns and the powers of persuasive design. But first, before we get started, we as UXers love stories. So we thought we'd kick things off with a bit of a story about how small design decisions can have big impacts for users. So this handsome chap here is Damien. Damien's our GM at Thirst Studios. We all love Damien. He's really great at his job. He's really witty, and he's always there for a killer dad joke. Now, when Damien started, GMs apparently need computers. We went out and we got him this. So that's the new MacBook 12-inch. Damien's often out on site with clients, so we decided a light, powerful, and somewhat sexy laptop seemed appropriate. However, when Damien finally got this thing out of the box, there was a little bit of a problem. Now, as everyone here will probably know, the new MacBook only has the one port. Now, when Damien opened this up, there was no adapter there. So how was Damien going to charge his phone, charge that new Magic Mouse, or hook up his keyboard or his monitor? In short, one small design decision by Apple had forced an unexpected decision on Damien. He needed to either buy an $130 adapter from Apple to continue using his screen and keyboard, or he needed to change the way he works. Resigned to this fact, Damien ordered the adapter and got down to work. Now, 15 minutes later, Damien needs to call a client, and he realizes his phone's about to die. He obviously can't charge it on his fancy new computer, so Damien borrows a port from a colleague's computer. Now, when he does this, the device comes up with a screen asking him to trust that new computer, and being really busy, Damien just pressed accept and moved on to make his call. Now, unfortunately, with the way Apple's ecosystem works, that gave Damien's colleague access to all the data and images on his phone. Some things that couldn't be unseen were seen, and long story short, we had to fire Damien. Ouch.
Ooh. Now we're going to come back to this story in just a moment, but first I thought I'll just introduce Gareth and myself. So I'm Ben. This is my good friend and colleague Gareth. We work at Thirst Studios in Melbourne. We're both designers. What we want to talk about for the next 20 minutes is pretty much exactly this kind of thing, and exploring those kind of far-reaching impacts that seemingly small decisions can have on a user, whether intentional or not. Now, that Damien story isn't actually true, or at least the last part of the story isn't true. We haven't really fired him. Now, what we're looking at here, next slide, please, buddy. Now, what we're looking at here is a decision that was made by Apple with either good or bad intent. Now, maybe it was to progress to an all-new, all-wireless ecosystem that Apple are planning with their next set of devices. Or maybe it was with consciously bad intent, and they're just kind of trying to push for an upswing in peripheral sales. Now, at the very least, design decisions like this can cause a bit of annoyance and maybe cost users a bit of extra cash. But at worst, the unintended potential can have much more catastrophic results. Now, in the online world, designs that are intentionally created to trick and deceive are known as dark patterns. And to create dark patterns, designers have to rely heavily on a really good understanding of cognitive science and human behaviors. And they're typically employed to benefit the company behind them. And they do things like, to do things like increase sales, perhaps, get a bit more sign-ups or something like that. Now, it's worth mentioning here that we're not talking about anti-patterns. They are kind of design mistakes or things that might have a negative impact on a user experience or break a convention, something like Ling's cars, perhaps. Now, this design hasn't been consciously put together to deceive or trick anyone. At least I don't think it has. It's just a shit design.
Now, we've become really interested in dark patterns of late, and more specifically, the convergence of human psychology, cognitive science, and the design patterns that are used to create them. So at a high level, you can start to think of dark patterns akin to the tricks of a dodgy car salesman, or, in this case, a dodgy Jawa. Now, you can't look under a website to see a telltale puddle of oil to identify a dark pattern. Instead, designers have created ingenious yet ethically questionable practices to trick users into doing things that they might not otherwise want to do. Now, luckily for us, the UX industry is fighting back against this kind of things, and there's some great resources out there to help designers. One of those is darkpatterns.org, so if you haven't seen it, please check it out. So darkpatterns.org lists out 14 identified dark patterns that currently exist in the web, and call out how they're done and what we can do to avoid those. So rather than go through them all with you here today, we're going to go through a few and explain how they work.
So first up, we're going to look at an example of something called the trick question dark pattern. So this is a good recent local example that was in The Age, which is a newspaper in Melbourne, and it was featured just a couple of months ago. And the article refers to a guy called Simon, it's not his real name, who was somebody that was really kind of conscious about his personal information and was happy with the one bank that he was with. So he was kind of surprised when he got some mail through the post from a rival bank, in this case ANZ, I think, that was personalised, asking him if he wanted to sign up or become a premium member. And it turns out that a few weeks earlier, Simon had actually been to he had a bit of sniffing around, spoke to somebody, finally got hold of somebody from ANZ who explained that they'd got his information from a company called Vida, who are a credit reporting agency. And it turns out a few weeks earlier, he had been to the Vida website and had filled out a form to get his own personal credit check. And at the bottom of the form, Vida had put a little pre-ticked checkbox. That always trips me up. Nice. To give consent to Vida and his corporate partners to use his personal information for marketing purposes. Now, this is a bit of a cheap trick, but it's by no means an accident. This is by design. What designers have done here, it's a bit cheeky, but they've, thank you. But they've basically, at the end of a long set of T's and C's, they've kind of, relying on the fact that people tend to scan and don't read things properly, especially at the end of a long form. So they've just gone that kind of one bit further with that example by putting that great big red button in there too, which goes that little bit further to just sort of distract a user from the offending text in the checkbox. So this is another example from the UK that takes that same trick like to the next level, so much so that we're actually amazed that this isn't illegal. I think it actually might well be. It's essentially doing the same thing. It's pre-ticking a checkbox and signing you up for to be spammed for the rest of your life. But in this case, rather than try and distract the user at the end of a long form or put a big button, they're just blatantly hiding it behind a link, which is very innocently titled More Information. So if you didn't click that, you would never see the offending text.
Another common dark pattern that's out there is called the bait and switch trick. Now, an example you may be familiar with is Candy Crush. And as you start playing Candy Crush, the game conditions you to hit the big call to action in the center of the screen. So when you first open up the app, you're hitting play. If you're starting a new level, once again, you're hitting play in the same position on the screen. If you need to retry a level, you're hitting retry once again in that same location. And if you lose a level and need to retry and you're out of moves, you can easily hit this. Now, the difference here is that it has a different function. So the UI has baited you into thinking you know what the action's going to be, i.e. just starting that new level, but instead, this makes you spend your virtual currency, and that's taking you one step closer to an in-app purchase. Now, designers here have taken advantage of human neuroscience. So by conditioning people to continually hit that call to action in the center of the screen, over time, your mind recognizes that pattern, and then you start diverting conscious attention from actually reading that label. Now, let's look at something that's a little bit more devious. So this one's friend spam. Now, a great example of this is LinkedIn's ad connections controversy from 2011. Some of you may be familiar with it. But in this case, when users were signing up, LinkedIn explicitly told them that they would not store their password or email anyone without their permission with their details. Now, some users agreed to put in some webmail contacts to invite people to use LinkedIn. But LinkedIn went on to use those contacts and email everyone without their consent. Now, the way they did this is they sent out the invite, but then sent out multiple follow-up emails to these different contacts, and they were written to make it look like they came from the original user. Now, it's pretty dodgy. Now, LinkedIn have since been involved in a class action lawsuit, and there's been a penalty of about $13 million in this case. So while that's not big for LinkedIn, we are starting to talk big numbers here.
Okay, so why do people do this? Why employ dark patterns in the first place, and why resort to such underhanded trickery? Well, as commercial designers, I'm sure we all recognise that our allegiance is often pulled in lots of different directions. So our work is a constant balance of business needs, user needs, and our desires as the designer. Now, when the pull is too much in one direction, that starts to not work for all parties. And if the pull is more towards business needs, that's when dark patterns can start to occur. So this can happen for a whole bunch of reasons, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that all the designers here are evil, but we are sometimes put in positions where it might be awkward and we're asked to do something that we don't necessarily agree with, or think is unethical maybe, things that, to please the boss or to meet a particular KPI. And it's difficult sometimes for designers to push back on those sorts of things, which forces a bit of a moral and ethical dilemma.
Now, this got us thinking, is there another more ethical way for us as designers to achieve these same kind of results without resorting to trickery? How can we persuade users to do the things that we need them to do without resorting to these tricks? Well, it turns out that you can use the same principles of psychology that dark patterns employ to persuade users instead, and to start invoking positive behaviour changes. Now, it's important to note here that we're talking about the ethical use of persuasive techniques here, and not leveraging cognitive science against users to achieve business goals. Persuasive design, when used responsibly, can leverage a good understanding of cognitive science and add value to a user's experience and increase user engagement. Above all else, it's our responsibility as the designer to ensure users retain the right of choice.
So how do we do this? Well, let's look a little bit more closely at human behaviour. And we really shouldn't be talking about persuasion or behaviour change and technology without mentioning this guy, which is B.J. Fogg. Now, B.J. Fogg is the founder of the Persuasive Tech Lab at Stanford University, and he's written a whole bunch of blog posts and articles on the subject. But what we want to look at more specifically is this, which is the Fogg behaviour model. So this model states that for a behaviour to occur, there needs to be a sufficient level of both motivation and ability. So if you want somebody to do something with your product, you need to somehow make them want to do it, and then make it easy for them to then do that thing. Now, as a designer, it's very typical that we focus on the ability bit, because that's what we normally have most control over. And there are 6 basic elements of ability that you can see here. So if you can affect those, then it means that you're more likely to get your user to do the intended behavior with your product. And while this might sound maybe a bit complicated, it actually isn't always that hard to make something easier to do, and it doesn't always have to be an enormous change to make quite a sort of a big and significant impact. A great example of this, I don't know if any of you are aware of this, if not, check it out afterwards, is the $300 million button story, which is a story told by Jared Spool. He's a well-known UX designer in the States. And it talks about how simply changing the label on a button led to an online retailer increasing their profits by $300 million in a single year. Now, there's actually a little bit more to that story. It was actually about removing a barrier at the point of purchase. But regardless, it's still a really good example of how, by making a really small, simple change you can to a user's ability, simple change to improve a user's ability, it can have an enormous positive impact. Uber is another great example of this, a great example of hitting that sweet spot between ability and motivation. This one probably wasn't that hard, because the motivation was already really high. People just want to get a lift home. But where the old model of kind of hunting around late at night to try and find and then hail a taxi made the whole process quite difficult, Uber have made it super easy through technology. So now if you want to get a lift home, you just pull your phone out of your pocket and then the car comes and finds you.
But as we mentioned earlier, these techniques can be used for good and evil. So let's look at an example here which blurs that ethical line just a little bit more. This retailer here has this laptop for sale for about $1,500 after cashback. So as a buyer, you know you're paying $1,700 up front, but you'll get that extra $200 back if you complete their rebate process. So ethically, This sounds pretty okay, right? Well, it's not really that straightforward. So it turns out you have to photocopy your receipt, you've got to fill in a big form, and then you've got to send it in to claim that rebate. And while you may have the motivation to do this, the ability to complete that cashback offer is low. As such, some buyers won't bother to go through the process of completing that cashback, meaning that there are some greater financial returns for that retailer. Now, let's be clear, this isn't a mistake here. This is a designed experience to maximise purchases and minimise rebates through cognitive science. If they had offered a $500 or a $1,000 rebate instead, perhaps they'd be altering that motivation factor enough to get a higher success rate, meaning less sneaky profits.
So now you can start to see how the motivation bit comes into play. It might be easier for a designer to affect a user's ability, but it's certainly not out of the question that you can also affect motivation through a good understanding of human psychology. So understanding what motivates people is the really powerful bit. If you've now kind of cast your mind back to those dark patterns examples, you'll realize that although they're outrageously dodgy, it's not just about the interface, but it's the way that the interface is put together through a good understanding of human behavior. Except for the LinkedIn example, that was just outright lying. So let's have a quick look at a couple of examples of some simple known kind of human behaviors that are commonly exploited for this sort of persuasion and motivation. So first up's our desire for completion and order. So staying focused on being active and keeping fit is a really hard behavior to crack. The motivation might be there to keep fit, but it's all too easy to kind of put it off and sort of stay on the couch instead. So among the techniques that Fitbit employ is this clever capitalization of our desire to want to kind of complete things and put things in order and have stuff finished. So just like some of us might feel a bit excited about achieving inbox 0, for example, some of us possibly a little too much, by adding little achievements along the way, it helps to kind of persuade someone or motivate them to complete. So in this case, the 10,000 step goal is a really nice way of kind of appealing to our natural tendency as humans to want to complete that, and therefore kind of motivating you to see it through. So LinkedIn used this technique as well to great effect by providing that completeness bar, and for some reason we feel naturally compelled to want to get to the 100% to complete it, and in doing that it kind of encourages us to add a little bit more information along the way. And as Gareth said at the start, we all have to be told an entertaining joke or a story. That emotional connection and the delight that we feel through things like humour is really attractive, and that in turn can be used to help with motivation and building trust. So I may be generalising a little bit, but it's certainly not a stretch to probably imagine that most of the guys in the room were not as excited about tracking their partner's pregnancies as maybe their partners were. It was certainly my case with me and with Gareth. Now this app named Who's Your Daddy is a pregnancy tracker aimed specifically for men. And it's brilliant. It uses great use of regular, well-written, humorous content that really kind of hooks you in and keeps you kind of motivated to keep using it. Gareth used this before his little boy Sam was born and just wouldn't stop banging on about it for 9 months.
It is really good. You should check it out. So, and who doesn't like a present now and again? Now, the concept of variable rewards is a really powerful motivator that designers can leverage to increase user engagement. And it's the thrill of unpredictability that can really hook users in. Now, the recent Pokemon Go craze is a perfect illustration of variable rewards in action. Now, Pokemon Go, if there's actually anyone that hasn't heard of it yet, is a free location-based augmented reality game that you play on your mobile device. So the game uses your phone's GPS and camera to help you capture, train, and battle virtual creatures called Pokemon. And they appear on the screen as if they're in the same real-world location as you are. Now in the game, there are 150 odd of these creatures to collect, and the variable reward here is that you never know which ones you're going to find as you're walking around in real-world locations. Some are really extremely rare, leading to lots of high fives in the first office whenever anyone managed to capture a Pikachu or something like that, mainly the developers. I think that's the little yellow one, right? But it's the power of variable rewards and the effect that they have on people that makes it one of the strongest tools in a designer's toolkit. But variable rewards does not have to be limited to games. And there are great examples out there where the technique has been used to great effect. So think of Facebook and Tinder. Both of these applications hook users using variable rewards. With Facebook, you're allowing people to endlessly scroll through numerous posts trying to find that next amusing cat gif. And with Tinder, the variable reward is that the hotter potential mate is just one swipe away, keeping users engaged. So now you can start to see how powerful these techniques really are. And the great thing about persuasive design is that its influence has the potential to do more than just help us get people to use our products. So coming back to Pokemon Go for just a minute, it's also a fantastic example of a product that has affected positive behaviour changes, not only delighting millions of people worldwide and increasing Nintendo's share price, but it's also helped to get lazy gamers off the couch, out into some fresh air, and getting some exercise. However, along with the positives, there's also some negatives. So there's been some unintended consequences of the design too. The app's been very famously responsible for a huge number of negative incidents, including some car crashes, people getting run over, people walking into things, and the occasional mugging.
And so this now brings us neatly full circle back to Damien and his laptop and his new fancy adapter that cost $130 but still doesn't actually accommodate all of the cables that he needs it to. So as we've explored today, us designers actually wield enormous power, but it's easy to forget that when you're in the coalface, buried in kind of research findings and wireframes and the like. So we're urging you now to kind of take a moment now and again to just kind of remember that it isn't just about aesthetics and usability, but it is actually about how we shape the lives of people everywhere. Our design decisions can have quite significant and far-reaching impacts. And while it's very hard for a designer to predict all of the impact that their designs are going to have, I think it's important to at least sort of stop and think now and again about those implications wherever possible. Design is an evolutionary discipline. It's something, we don't invent things, we really kind of learn a lot from the past. And the designers practicing the craft now, so all of you sitting here today, Gareth and myself, we're kind of setting an example for the future generations of designers. So we're kind of imploring you, don't take these dark patterns, cheap, easy options, but instead do understand that we do have great power, and we can use cognitive science to do things like influence and persuade, but we just need to be really respectful of that power and make sure that we use it for good and not for evil. Thank you very much.
Thank you.